This happened just a couple of years ago. I went to Ireland to study for a couple of weeks. There, I met this large group of people from my same country. I didn't know anyone. One boy caught my attention among all of them. In the exact same moment I saw him, I thought, I've already seen him. He just seemed so familiar. I approached him and we started talking. I didn't mention to him that he looked familiar. I found out that he lives really far from my city, in a region I have never visited, and that he has never visited my region either. I also found out he arrived in Ireland after me, so there was no way for me to see him at the airport or anything like that. Then, after some time chatting, he said, "Have we already met? I was thinking you look really familiar." That really freaked me out. We never figured out how it was possible to feel like we had met each other before, because we certainly never had. And to this day, it just feels like such a glitch in the matrix kind of experience. I don't really know how to explain it. Reading some posts about glitch in the matrix experiences reminded me of an experience my mom had about 10 years ago. I asked her about it again tonight, and she retold it to me to make sure I had all the right details, so I'm telling the story on her behalf. My mom was driving into the city one day and was stuck in traffic. We live in Ireland. She was looking out the window at the buildings and saw an old woman sitting in a wheelchair in the doorway of one of the buildings. She described this woman as a shawlie, which apparently was the name of the women in this part of the city in the 1940s and 50s who worked in the marketplace. They were called shawlies because of the black shawls they wore. She remembers the woman looking out onto the road with a solemn expression, and my mom was particularly fascinated by her because it had been so many years since she had seen one of these women. The traffic moved on and she parked in a car park around the corner from the street. About an hour later, she was leaving the city and looked over to the side of the street as she was passing to see if the woman was still there. All of the buildings were run down and boarded up, including the doorway the woman had been standing in. She said that the buildings looked entirely different to how she had seen them just an hour before. My mom has always thought of this as sort of a seeing through the veil type of thing. But could it be a glitch in the matrix after all? Back in May of 2012, my family and I went to Ireland. We were staying in a cottage in a rural area that was far away from any major city or town. 2 days before we were leaving, my cousin and I and her 2-year-old daughter, Maisie, were outside in the garden. Maisie had one of those interactive books for young kids that play nursery rhymes, row your boat, hickory dickory, things like that, whenever you pressed a certain button. She was messing around, pressing multiple buttons, when she pressed a green one that was supposed to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but it didn't. Instead, the book played a song that neither I nor her mother recognized. Even weirder, however, was the fact that Maisie began to sing one line toward the end of the song, which I remember being something like, "I will reach the golden city to join the angel band." Her mother, of course, was shocked, as she was only 2 years old and was just beginning to talk. These words were extremely advanced for her vocabulary, even if she had only learnt from memory. When I got home, I searched the lyrics Maisie had sung, and it turned out to be what I had speculated, a hymn, specifically one called The Pilgrim's Journey. None of our family was religious, and neither of us understood where Maisie had learnt the hymn, and even less why the book had played it in the first place. We tried pressing the green button again and again, but it never played the hymn again, just Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, as it was supposed to. In 2004, I went to Ireland on the super cheap during this one magical week where there were insanely low fares. That's not the glitch, I'm just nostalgic for that time. While visiting family there, I picked up a Ross O'Carroll Kelly book, not realizing that it was a popular series, and read The Orange Mocha Frappuccino Years in about a day. The first-person narrator uses a Bret Easton Ellis-like voice, where everything is his impressions in real time. I found it hilarious. At one point, we were walking down Grafton Street in Dublin. We walked past a busker and he was playing Don't Look Back in Anger, and he was right on the So Sally Can Wait, etc. part as we walked by. Something about how he was singing his heart out, even though it's sort of a cheesy song, impressed me. And I turned to my partner and said, "You know, I don't care what anyone else says. I love this song." And she said, "Yeah, too bad the buskers have ruined it." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, I heard another one doing it earlier." I had been with her, but I hadn't noticed. Later, in a train station newsagent's, we were selecting supper. It was either a triangle sandwich each or a candy bar each, and another book in the Ross O'Carroll Kelly series, The Teenage Dirtbag Years, to read on the next train. We chose candy and the book. She'd read 2 pages, then I'd read 2, passing it back and forth, perfect for a late evening train where half the people were sleeping and the rest were quiet. She handed me the book with an odd expression at one point, and I looked down to read. It said, "So I'm walking down Grafton Street with Sorsha, and we walk past this busker, and he's doing Don't Look Back in Anger, giving it all, so Sally can wait." And I turn to Sorsha, and I say, "I don't care what anyone says. That's a great song." And she says, "Yeah, too bad the buskers have ruined it." My own skepticism says, okay, common street, common buskers, and if you Google the title of the song and busker and Grafton, there's a YouTube video of a guy playing that song in 2014. So it is a cliché. And our conversation wasn't at all original, filled with phrases that are really just filler in a way. But it still felt really eerie. And honestly, it kind of still does. This occurred about 3 years ago. I had a position as a buyer, and as such would receive tons of cold calls and emails from people trying to get our company to try their products for resale. Also important, our company had a digital phone system, like VoIP. There was one central number, and it followed a phone tree to multiple offices via internet connection. Voicemails were available on our big office phones, but the recording would also be sent to our emails. So one day I received a voicemail from a phone number I recognized as someone who had been attempting to get a hold of me to sell me their products. Oddly, the voicemail was something like 15 minutes long. Curious, I began to listen to it. The message begins with just static and the sound of rustling. Seems like a classic butt dial, or maybe they forgot to hang up when the voicemail clicked on. I fast-forwarded the message just to see if anything was ever heard. And yes, suddenly a clear voice. They're having a one-sided conversation. I think, ooh, these can be fun sometimes. Except the one-sided conversation is clearly with me. The person on the phone is referencing my then recent maternity leave, our company by name, a few other pretty identifying details that currently escape me. They'd stop speaking, and it would be blank air, and then they would answer a pertinent question that I would have asked in that kind of a conversation, clearly speaking to me. But I never spoke to this company or this person. I did receive additional emails from them later that were clearly initial attempts at communication and not a follow-up conversation. I checked with coworkers in case somehow, somewhere, their conversation got picked up in my voicemail, and nope. Coworkers and husband were equally confused, but with zero explanation, we all just had to move on. I was about 15 years old when this happened. It happened in school, which was in Ireland. In my school, we had compulsory subjects that we had to take, such as math, English, etc. We were able to pick 2 option subjects. I chose technology, kind of like woodworking but with circuits as well, and art. My best friend of like 12 years and I got put into the same technology class. Now, to be honest, all we ever did in that class was mess around. We never completed our projects, and instead we would just burn stuff and do stupid things. Anyway, each table was square, and one person was sat at each edge, and beside each person, connected to the desk, was a mechanical vise. It's basically something that you could tighten to hold something in place. My friend and I would literally put anything in there and just squish the crap out of it. One day, we had a piece of copper wire. It was quite thick. I'd like to say a centimeter in width, and it was probably like 8 or 9 centimeters long. We placed it in the vise and started twisting the knob and tightening it on the wire. When the vise fully closed, we opened it to see what would have happened to the wire. However, when we opened it, it was gone, and I mean like fully vanished. We started to look under the table, in the vise, around other tables, even behind our teacher's desk. After looking everywhere, we thought maybe we dropped it and somebody picked it up. We had like 8 others in our class, so we just asked them if they had picked up a copper wire. And of course they replied, "No, didn't you just squish it?" Or, "No, I didn't see anything." Now, I want to emphasize that my friend and I spent at least an hour looking for this wire, and we tested another wire in the vise to see if that would vanish, but instead it just fell on the floor when the vise was opened. We just laughed it off and said that it's probably some kind of interdimensional thing, but we've really been puzzled about what happened ever since. On May 3rd, 2017, my life was pretty similar to how it is now. I'm a bartender in a smallish beach town in Florida, so I know most people who frequent the bars in our downtown area, either as other service industry workers or patrons. I also have always lived within walking distance to work and the strip of bars and restaurants. That being said, I was 23 at the time and constantly hung out with a pretty large group of friends and coworkers, and going out almost daily after work. Although this absolutely made no sense from the beginning, I thought for a while that there might be an explanation to what I experienced. If there is, I never got one. And I'm 100% sure that I do not know the person who this mystery item belonged to, but let me back up. I was going through my trunk before a camping trip one day with a guy I was dating, who lived in the apartments across the street from mine. As we're clearing things out, we find a large black duffel bag stuffed in the very back of the trunk. Upon opening it, I discovered it was full of various soccer gear, cleats, socks, safety pads, and a jersey with a name I didn't recognize on it. I had zero recollection of anyone putting anything in my trunk. I don't have any friends who play soccer, and I never have. The name on the jersey is one that I've literally never heard of, even now, and searching on social media didn't yield any results. The guy who I was dating at the time thought that I was lying and thought that it was from another guy I was hanging out with or had hung out with and dated in the past. He didn't believe me that I had no idea how it got there, who the person whose name was on the jersey was, and didn't hang out with anyone who played soccer. That drove me even more insane because I literally didn't even discover the bag in the trunk on my own previously. This was the first time I had ever seen it. I asked every person that I was around regularly as well as pretty much anyone I'd seen in the past month. No one had any clue what I was talking about or recognized the name on the jersey. Please note that there are no spare keys for my car, and I never let anyone drive my car. I always keep it obsessively locked, and my car has never been broken into. I ended up throwing the bag away a couple of years afterwards. I kept it in my trunk forever, hoping that the mystery would solve itself eventually, but No. This will forever drive me nuts. To this day, I have no idea who that person is or how that stuff got into my trunk. I was around 24 years old at the time of this event. I have always had trouble sleeping, and I would sleep during the day most of the time. This particular day, I woke up way later than usual, and once I did, I was really confused because it was already dark outside. I started wondering what had happened to my mother, because she never takes her keys with her. I'm the one who opens the door for her when she gets back from work at the end of the day, so I wondered why she wasn't home yet. I was about to grab my phone and call her when I realized some of the lights from our hallway were on. For a second, I thought I was dealing with an intruder or something, but I heard my mom's voice right away. How did she get inside? How come I never heard the door? I got up to make sure it was really her, and it was. When I asked her how she had gotten inside, she got really mad at me, asking if I was crazy, and told me that I was the one who had opened the door for her. I asked her how the workday was and went straight back to my room after. I never opened that door. I was sleeping. So who the hell opened it for her? The door was locked from the inside. Yes, I've already considered sleepwalking, but I've never had it, and no one has ever seen me doing it. And I think my mom would have noticed if I was sleepwalking as opposed to just opening the door as usual. To this day, I know that somebody, who apparently looked like me, opened that door, but I never did. This wasn't anything mind-blowing, but it happened to me earlier today, and it made me so confused. I live in an apartment building, and the ground level is like a communal public space. I was taking the lift down from my apartment level to this ground level to exit the place in the morning. The lift doors have transparent panels, so you can look out of the lift, and because of how lifts usually slow down when they're reaching the destination floor, and the doors sometimes take a few seconds to open, I had a good 10 seconds to look at what was happening at the public space in the ground floor. From what I saw, there were 3 men mopping the floor, and one old lady, who I know is my neighbor, was walking across the space in front of these 3 men. But when I was in the lift, I noticed that all 4 of them were frozen. But it was weird because they weren't just standing in casual positions. The men looked like they had just frozen as they were mopping, and the old lady was literally mid-stride. I spent a good 3 or 4 seconds wondering what was going on as I waited for the lift doors to open. But the moment the lift doors opened and I stepped out, everyone started moving. The men went back to mopping the floor, and the lady continued walking again. It was so odd, though, because it literally looked as though somebody had pressed play on them when I stepped out of the lift. It was so weird to me. I have no idea what happened. Years ago, I was working nights as a phlebotomist, the person who draws your blood, in a hospital. There was this doctor who was notorious for ordering recurrent tests incorrectly. He would order a single draw when he really needed a serial draw 90% of the time. But because 1 in 10 times he really did want a single, you always had to check with him. This night happened to be the start of daylight savings, so at 1:59 a.m., the clocks would turn to 3 a.m. instead of 2. At about 1:30, I get an order on my screen from this doctor. I was the only phleb on nights, and I worked with 2 techs. I sighed and showed them. Oh look, Dr. X ordered this test again. I'll see if he's on the floor and if he really wants this or if he wants the cereal draw. I went up to the floor and he was at the nurse's station. I remember it so clearly because he was wearing plaid black and yellow skinny pants under his white coat. I couldn't stand the guy, and I thought his loud, ugly pants just drew attention to his loud, ugly personality. I walked up to him and said, "Hey, I just got this order for XYZ patient. Did you mean to order the 3 cereal draws?" He was dismissive and said something like, "Of course I did. Can you just draw 3? I, of course, cannot just come poke a patient 3 different times without orders, so I asked him if he could reorder it, and I would go back to the lab to print the stickers and come right back and do the first draw. I drew a couple of patients, quickly knowing that he would take a few minutes to get the order in. I rode the elevator back to the lab and checked my computer. It was 1:58, and the orders were there, so I printed them and stuck my specimens in the centrifuge while they printed. I pulled the labels off the printer and looked closely, and realized that he had ordered the single draw yet again. I pulled up the order code, wrote it down for him, and went back to the floor to just ask him to do this order exactly. When I got to the floor, he was standing exactly where he had been when I came up the first time, wearing plain black pants. I assumed somebody had forced him to change, and I knew he was going to be really annoyed when I asked him to reorder the labs. By now it was definitely past 1:59, so the clocks were reading 3-something. I asked him if he could reorder the test. He was totally pleasant and not at all frustrated that I was asking him again. I asked him if room 2008 had thrown up on him or something, and if that's why he had changed his clothes. He then seemed offended and was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Sorry to offend, but when I came up to you earlier, you had on yellow pants, so I just assumed something happened." He scoffed at me and said, "I've been wearing these all night. I don't own yellow pants. You must be confused." I'm thinking he's just being weird and should just admit he got puked on, but whatever. I go back to the lab, print the orders, and finally draw the patient. I stop to talk to one of the nurses for a moment, and on my way back down, she says something like, "I saw you talking to Dr. X. He's being weird tonight, right?" And she seemed kind of shaken. I said, "Yeah, he was wearing those hideous pants and then tried to pretend he wasn't." She told me that he walked into a room on one side of the wing wearing the yellow pants right before the time change, and then walked out seconds later from the other side of the wing wearing black. I was weirded out and went back down to the lab, where the techs asked me where the samples were for the patients that I had drawn, after first asking Dr. X to reorder. I opened the centrifuge I had left them in, and they weren't there. The orders showed that the labels had never been printed, and when I apologetically went to redraw the patients, they had no idea who I was, and didn't have cotton or tape on their arm from where I'd drawn them earlier. I still have absolutely no explanation for this. It appears that everything between first receiving the incorrect order and returning to ask him to reorder for the second time never happened. The techs didn't remember me showing them that he had ordered incorrectly the first time or anything. The only reason I didn't check into a psychiatric facility was the nurse who corroborated my story. We hardly knew each other at the time, but we trauma bonded over the experience, and we've talked about it so many times. The weirdest part to me is that it coincided with daylight saving starting. That is completely a societal construct. Nothing actually happens when we move the clock, so what the heck? I still get the chills when I think or talk about it. And because people always question why I was so tuned into the clocks and to know exactly when things happened, I was a worker whose shift was an hour shorter that night. We all kind of watch the clock and do a mini celebration when it changes. This is a glitch that I have thought about a lot over the years. I have no explanation. It was just a weird thing that happened. It was 2011, and we were 16. My best friend and I were in town, wanting to get some McDonald's. Her card declined, so we were walking to the bank opposite the mall. While we were crossing the road, we saw her older brother's best friend, Mark. We both yelled out, "Hello, Mark." I yelled out, "Nice shirt." It was a lion with flames all around it. I remember very well because I had a huge crush on him at the time. He ignored us completely, like he didn't even hear us. We both commented about how rude that was, finished crossing the road and got to the ATM on the other side. While there, Mark comes along from the opposite direction. He's wearing the same shirt, and we ask him how he got there. That we had just seen him cross the road, and the light hadn't gone again, so he couldn't have crossed again. He's very confused and said that he just came from the opposite direction and had never crossed the road yet. I mentioned this to my best friend a week ago, and she remembers the same thing that I do. Neither of us have any idea what happened. This happened yesterday, and I can't stop thinking about it. My boyfriend wasn't home, and I had put my phone on charge behind the couch. I sat down and started reading. About 10 minutes later, I heard my boyfriend shout, "Baby," and I sat up, startled. He sometimes does this when he comes home just to make me aware of his presence before he comes into the room, because I always jump if I don't hear him come in. I sat for a second because I couldn't hear any movement, then turned around to get off the couch and go see him and see what he was doing. As I got up, my phone lit up, and it was a text message from him, literally just a few seconds after I'd heard him call me. I thought nothing of it until I opened the living room door, and he wasn't standing in the hallway. I checked my phone, and he'd actually texted me something pretty urgent, and it made me even more freaked out that I had heard him shout so clearly. It felt like in some weird way, whatever it was trying to get my attention, to turn around and get my phone. So I always thought this was strange. I even told people about it, but chalked it up to people working overnight or something. But now, I'm not so sure. I worked for one of the biggest tech companies for about 10 years. I traveled a lot and sometimes taught workshops. I remember visiting Puerto Rico to deliver a workshop. I was really impressed with the people in the office. They were serving lunch on silver dishes and had a really classy atmosphere. It was a company location, so there were no customers in the office. One strange thing that happened, but not necessarily weird, was after eating lunch with the students, I'd started teaching again, and little by little, the office people would just casually walk in, right past the projector and me lecturing, and grab lunch. I wasn't mad, I actually found it kind of funny. Besides, the staff had some good-looking and generally nice people, so there's that too. The strange part was that I remember after one class cleaning up for the night and visiting the bathroom before leaving, and I noticed that it was a bit aged. Maybe leaking faucets and water stains, nothing gross, but it was definitely an old bathroom. There were several stalls and urinals. Now, I left likely at around 5 o'clock, and the office was closing down. The next day when I visited that bathroom, it was completely different and looked brand spanking new. I'm talking marble, tile, everything looked like it had literally been done overnight. I remember mentioning this and really getting no response from anybody. That night was when the oil refinery blew up. I booked my flight a day early and got out. I was afraid that it was either an attack or the smoke would force the airport to be closed down, which would cause havoc with me trying to get home. I never did figure out what was going on there with that bathroom, or with the people. Looking back on it, maybe they weren't real either, or maybe it was some kind of glitch. I've mentioned this a few times to people over the years as a funny story, thinking that they had actually remodeled this bathroom overnight. But now that I think of it, there's no possible way that they did that. I was leaving when the office was getting ready to close. There were no signs, no workers coming in, and no recollection of the employees the next day. Plus, this work wasn't just a makeover. Like I said, it was granite counters, tile walls, the works. It was just very strange. A couple of years ago, I experienced a moment straight out of the Truman Show. I was skiing on Whistler Mountain with my family. I'm a fast skier, so I usually will zip down the mountain and then wait for my dad to catch up, with my phone in hand in case he needs to reach me. One run, I stopped about halfway down the mountain to wait for him to catch up, and received a phone call from my dad. When I picked up, he didn't answer. Instead, I heard what sounded like radio chatter. I couldn't make out exactly what was being said, except for one thing. We lost him. Wait, he stopped by the tree. Then the line went dead, and my dad came skiing down. Not only was he not on his phone, but his phone was dead. I told my family about this, and even had the phone call record in my recent phone calls as evidence that I had at least received a call when I claimed I did. What was especially strange is that my younger brother had a memory of the event as well. He said that I had skied to the bottom of the mountain where he was eating lunch, and that I had received the call in front of him, but I didn't. He also told me the next morning that he had a nightmare that men in suits were standing all around his bed, telling him to forget what he had seen, and that, quote, he could never know the truth, he being me. He could have easily been messing with me, sure, but he seemed really shaken up at the time, like genuinely scared, and he's still fascinated by the events whenever I bring them up today. When this happened, it completely shattered my worldview about reality. I still find myself questioning what's real. It was a very strange event. I feel like I was never supposed to experience it. Like I said, it eerily reminds me of that scene in The Truman Show where his car radio is playing security radio chatter of them following him. I don't know what to make of it, but it was really, really strange. Approximately 5 years ago, one of my coworkers, an 18-year-old woman at my job, didn't show up for her shift one day. The next time we worked together, I asked why she had called out the other day. We just so happened to be in the presence of one of our supervisors, and we were all standing close to the entrance. She told us that her house had flooded because her younger brother left the faucet running right before her family went out to dinner. They came back to the house being mildly flooded. Unfortunate, but not too crazy of a story. The next day at work, the same coworker and same supervisor were standing in the exact same spot as the day prior, close to the entrance, and were talking. I asked my coworker how her house and family were doing. She asked me what I was talking about and why I would ask her that. I said, because of your house flooding. She became very visibly upset and bothered and demanded to know how I knew that her house had flooded. I became very confused. I asked her, "Don't you remember telling me that, literally just yesterday?" She insisted that she didn't tell me about her house flooding and demanded to know how I found out this information. I was bewildered and I was convinced she must be messing with me, because she 100% told me and our supervisor about her house flooding. I turned to our supervisor and I'm like, did she not tell us about her house flooding yesterday? Expecting an obvious yes in response. However, our supervisor said she had no idea that her house had flooded either, and it was the first time she was hearing about it. I was stunned almost into silence, and I'm incoherently babbling, trying to explain that she definitely did tell us this. My coworker cuts me off and says, "There's absolutely no way you could have known about that. I haven't told anyone about my house flooding aside from our general manager. Not even," and inserted the name of another coworker who she was really close with. She said, "If I haven't even told her about that, why the F would I tell you?" She literally looked at me with disgust and stormed off. At this point, I'm still convinced that it was some kind of elaborate prank. I asked the supervisor who had witnessed it before about the whole thing again, and she still maintained that she was unaware about her house flooding. This disturbed me greatly, but it's just so freaking insane that I was still convinced they had to be messing with me. The next time I worked with flooded house coworker, I said hello to her, and she just glared at me in response and walked off. After that day, it was never the same. We worked together for another 6 months or so, and she continued to avoid me. If we had to interact, she was rude to me and treated me like I was some kind of creepy stalker that was obsessed with her. I swear on my life that she told me about her house flooding. I remember it very vividly, but her reaction to me knowing was so intense and so prolonged, I really don't think she was faking that. My supervisor also maintained that she never actually told us about it. I even talked to her best friend about it, who also said that she had not previously known about the house flooding. Her best friend told me that it was best to just leave the topic alone and to leave flooded house girl alone. I have no explanation for this, and when I tell people about the situation, they either tell me I'm crazy or making it up. I don't know how to explain it. I don't even believe in parallel universes, but I don't know what else it could be. Other than a switch up in the timelines or something. I don't know. It haunts me though. I think about it all the time, and it just makes me feel sick. I just got home from work an hour ago. I have these dreams every night where this Japanese girl is always riding shotgun in my dream car, which is a 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner. The dreams have been getting a little too realistic for my taste. For example, she has a whole name, first, middle, and last. Either way, the dreams almost always consist of she and I just driving around and laughing at some dumb jokes. Well, tonight on my way home, I decided to glance over to the passenger side mirror, and she's just sitting there. Same hair, same clothes. It was her. I'm not sure why, but I wasn't really unnerved by it in any way. That is, until she looked over to me and smiled. I smiled back, and she was gone. Poof. She just vanished. As if she was never there. Hell, the seatbelt was even undone. I'm honestly not sure how to feel about this. I'm guessing that in another reality or universe, I'm dating the girl of my dreams, and maybe there was some kind of overlap. I guess dreams could be realities. Maybe they're alternate realities. But could there be an actual meaning behind all of this? I still can't figure it out. What's even weirder is that I did some Googling about her name, and I can't find anybody that exists with those names put together, first, middle, and last. I have no idea what's going on. This happened 2 years ago, sometime between September and November of 2019. My girlfriend, we'll call her Mary, and I drove up to Berkeley, California for the weekend, my hometown. I now live in Los Angeles. We went there to see some of my old friends. The day we arrived, we went straight to my oldest friend, we'll call him Paul's, dad's house, where my family spent every Christmas and Thanksgiving my whole childhood. His family is quite well off and has a large property at the top of Berkeley Hills, with a full panoramic view of the Bay Area, Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco skyline, etc. It's a pretty breathtaking view. It was probably about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, as the sun was starting to dip but not yet setting. The 3 of us were sitting on his deck in the backyard, catching up, about to get in the hot tub with this gorgeous view. Now, for the sake of what happens next, I feel like I should describe the seating arrangement. I was sitting on a bench perpendicular to the bay, with Mary sitting to my right. I was facing Paul, who was sitting on a bench perpendicular to mine. We were just telling stories, making jokes, and laughing quite a bit, when, out of nowhere, a rapid black rip sped between where Paul and I were sitting, making a loud tearing sound, and vanished from view as quickly as it had appeared. Initially, I thought I had hallucinated it, until realizing that Paul and Mary were equally stunned and shocked by what I had just seen. All of us were like, "What the hell was that?" And it became immediately clear that it was no hallucination, especially since we all quickly agreed on its description. Whatever it was long and black. I had thought for a moment that it was the largest bird I'd ever seen, but its speed was unlike anything I've ever witnessed. It was just rapid. We all looked in the direction that it seemed to be headed, but there was nothing where it should have been, despite being able to see for miles. It was present for what felt like a millisecond. Blink and you'd have missed it. We discussed it, each of us as bewildered as the next, and agreed that maybe it was like a hole in a pair of jeans ripping wide open. We all decided that it felt like a rip had sped between us and closed as soon as it had opened. There was no follow-up or evidence of the phenomenon, except for the certainty that we had all seen it happen. I don't know what this was, and I've never had any similar experiences, but to this day, the 3 of us all remember it vividly. I don't know if it was a rip in the Matrix or what, but I'd love to hear thoughts of what this could have been. Has anyone else ever had a similar experience? I am a 26-year-old female, and my boyfriend is a 26-year-old male. One day, we went for a big walk around the town that we were living in at the time. It was the middle of the day, probably around 2 p.m., and we were both completely sober. At one point, we were on the side of the road, on one of those lanes where people run and walk, and we saw a female child, around 12 years old if I had to guess, jogging. She was in our lane and coming our way. I remember finding it strange for this child to be out jogging on her own. There was no one else around, and it was a pretty remote area, like a countryside road. But I didn't mention anything to my boyfriend. We were walking side by side, so I walked behind him so that she could pass. I stopped seeing her for a few seconds, but when I saw her again next to me, she was a fully grown woman in her mid-40s. He immediately looks at me before I can say anything, in total shock, and asks, "Did you see that?" I asked him, did he also see a child turn into a woman? And he said, yeah. He said that she never really left his sight, but as he blinked and looked again, she was no longer a child. We even looked back to confirm, and she was still the mid-40s woman. Since then, I've been noticing other smaller glitches. I don't know if they were always there and I just didn't pay attention, or if that started a whole chain of events. Either way, it was odd. This isn't exactly a horrifying story, so don't get too disappointed if you're not terrified. For background, I'm a 15-year-old Irish fella called Ross. I go to school in Ireland, and I'm now in third year. At the start of the second year, I knew a fella that joined the school. I was in charge of showing him around, and we've been good friends ever since. He is Portuguese, and his name is Tiago. I'll call him Tig for the story. His school bag is a fairly small, bright red bag. He's a little bit shorter than me, and his hair is quite short and brown in color. One day, I was upstairs in my school. It was break time, and I was going to my group's usual spot. I turned a corner and I saw Tig walking along the hallway. This was weird because at the distance I was from him, I would have seen him come up the stairs. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I sped up to catch up to him. There was another corner coming up. He rounded it and I followed suit, except he wasn't there. There was a staircase going back down and two bathrooms, one for lads and one for lassies, but no Tig. Considering how close behind him I was, he would have had to have sprinted towards and then jumped down the stairs or jogged into one of the bathrooms. If he went for the stairs, I would have heard it, so I figured he was in the bathroom. I sat at the bench and waited. Tig was the first other person in our group to arrive. He rounded the corner and set his bag down. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't in the bathroom, and whatever or whoever I had followed was not Tig, even though it looked just like him. Same backpack and everything. I asked him if he had already been up there, to which he replied he hadn't. He had no reason to lie. Now, I know what you're thinking. It was someone else. First of all, the person that I saw looked the exact same as my friend from the back. Second of all, no one else in the school has that bag. At least I've never seen anyone else with it. And third, the only place the person could have gone without sprinting down the stairs, which I probably would have caught a glimpse of anyway, would be the bathroom. No one ever came out of the bathroom. At least nobody that I didn't watch go into it. Finally, my friend is a fairly distinct character. Not many people have the same body build as he does. Like I said at the start, it's not exactly terrifying, but I do believe it to be a glitch in the Matrix. About 25 years ago, I lived in Texas. Most of my family lived in Utah. My sister called me one afternoon and told me that my niece and her 3-year-old daughter were in an accident, but had to be in 2 different hospitals. The 3-year-old, Court, was at a children's hospital. You have to remember, there were no cell phones back then. My sister told me that they were fixing to do surgery on Court for a blood lump behind her eye. My sis was with her as her mom was having surgery at the other hospital. My sis asked me to pray for them both. I was laying on my bed praying, but when I prayed for Court, it felt like I was in her room, and I put my hand on her head while I prayed for her. Jump forward 2 years, and my family went to Utah for a family reunion. One of the days that I was there, my sister asked if I wanted to see pictures of Court in the hospital, and I did. The sister said that a weird thing happened. Court was sleeping, so sister went to get snacks out of the machine. When she got back to the room, Court was awake. Remember, she was only 3. Court asked my sister where Aunt Deb was. That'd be me. She said that I was in Texas. Court said, no, she was in here. She put her hand on my head and she was talking. So, yeah, I guess I really was with her. I don't know if that's some sort of glitch in the Matrix sort of thing, but it certainly was memorable. This happened when I was 16. My mother used to take my phone at night and then give it back to me when she woke me up for school the following morning. Every morning started the same. She would wake me up, I would go to the bathroom to take a shower and get ready. I'd come out and put on my uniform, she'd give me breakfast, and then I would run out of the house to catch the public bus. This is the important part. I would always take my phone into the bathroom with me. I'm the type of person who plans my day by the minutes. I knew I had to take my shower for X amount of minutes, get out of the bathroom by X, leave the house at X, etc. So the same routine. I was in the bathroom and I remember it so clearly. My shower took way longer than usual, and instead of it being 7:15 when I got out, the phone said 7:23. I remember rushing out of the bathroom as I was supposed to leave the house by 7:25 on most days. I rushed and put on my uniform, and my mom followed me half out of the house with my breakfast. I distinctly remember checking the clock before I left, too, trying to figure out if I had time to catch the bus or if I would have to take a car to school. The clock was at 7:28, so I did have time to catch the bus. It was a snowy day in January. I also remember that vividly. The sky was gray and dark, but that's how it was every day. The streets were eerily empty. I stood at my bus stop, which was on the side of a pretty busy street. Not today. No one was on the street. Maybe one car passed by every few minutes. I started to get worried that I would be late for school, and that's when I looked down at my phone to call my dad to see if he could drop me off. It was 4:03 in the morning. I was shocked. It couldn't be. I walked back home, and my mom was still up getting my other sister ready for school. She was surprised to see me. I told her to check the time, and to her surprise too, it was 4 o'clock in the morning. She started saying how she had sworn that her alarm woke her up at 7, like it does every single morning. We both looked at each other and just swore that we'd seen the time. A 4 a.m. snowy day and a 7 a.m. snowy day looked almost identical outside, but I know that I checked the clock enough times to confirm that it was in the 7 o'clock hour. Regardless, we all went back to sleep, and again I woke up at 7. This time I made my dad take me to school, and the whole day I had my eyes on the clock. This incident never happened to me again, but I still have no explanation for it. I've had a couple of ghost encounters that really messed me up, but this one in particular was the worst. My mom was dating this guy, who wasn't like a super country guy, but not like a normal country guy either. He also had a son, who I still stay in close contact with to this day. Basically, almost every Sunday, we would go out to my stepdad's mom's house. She lived in the middle of the woods, but not too secluded. Like there were other houses in the area. But directly across the dirt road, there was this abandoned house that pretty much looked exactly what you would expect an abandoned house to look like. My stepbrother and I would go in there every once in a while just for fun, and we would see some pretty weird stuff. Like a random chair in the middle of a room, a cooler full of dead roses. But one day, we were headed in there like usual. But I took one step in and I wanted to throw up. My stepbrother kept going and was telling me it was fine and to just come in, but I was not going in there. A couple of minutes of talking go by, and all of a sudden my brother's face turns pale as hell. He drops his water bottle and he runs out without saying a word. I follow him, asking him to slow down, and he says that we're never going back in there again. When I asked why, he said that he heard a voice whisper in his ear and tell him to run. We never told our parents until like 2 years later. At the time, we were 12. And, true to his word, we never went back in there again. My name is Luna, and I'm 35 years old, and I'm a hospice nurse. I've been a hospice nurse for the last 10 years. This is a story about a young woman I took care of that I became very close to. The patient in question was 23 years old and was dying of liver cancer. She was given about 6 months when she was told she was terminal and was put on hospice. I started going to her house twice a week at first, and we really liked each other. As she started slowly going downhill, I started coming more and more until I was there every day. Most of the time, we would just sit and talk. She was a very pretty girl with long black hair and blue eyes. She was very athletic and active before she got cancer, so not being able to do things for herself or get up and around without help was very hard for her. She always wore a minty-smelling perfume, which I liked very much. I was with her the day she died, and that was a very hard day for me. I got home pretty late that day, and I made dinner for myself and sat down in the living room in front of the television. I had been sitting there for about 5 minutes when I smelled a minty smell that was just like my patient's perfume. Then I heard a cough and a female voice call my name. I looked over toward the kitchen, and there was my patient standing beside the kitchen counter. She just looked at me, and she was smiling, and then she waved and disappeared. I think it was just her way of saying she was okay. Sometimes to this day, I still feel like she's watching over me. Sometimes I still smell her perfume, especially if I've had a hard day. I was around 12 years old. It was during the summer when school was off. My parents would work during the day, so it was just me and my sister, home alone. One day we were in the basement watching a movie. I had to go to the bathroom. As I came out, I saw someone run into the storage room, which was between the stairs and the laundry room. I thought it was my sister hiding from me, so I started yelling her name as I approached the door. I looked in, and I saw a white figure dash to the side from behind the furnace. I walked in and started yelling my sister's name again. I was just about to go look behind the furnace when my sister said, "What?" from right behind me. I asked her if she had just been in the storage room, and she said no. I told my sister what happened, and we were so scared we ran upstairs and spent the rest of the day hiding in our room until my parents came home. I was driving home last night at about 1 a.m. It was already a full moon, so I was on high alert for any animals that might cross my path, as I drive through a very rural area that's mostly dense forest on either side of the road for miles to get back. Anyway, as I was turning a corner, a deer jumped out in front of me. I slammed on my brakes and honked the horn. The deer ran into the forest on the opposite side of the road, and I sped up, rounding the corner. That's when the freaky stuff started happening. A tall white figure was standing at the edge of the woods. I didn't get a good look at it because looking at it felt wrong, so I sped up. But it had a human shape other than being about 9 feet tall. I couldn't make out a face, but it was glowing slightly. After that, I sped up, hoping to get home as fast as possible. And the whole way home after that incident, my car kept making weird noises, and my radio had way more static than usual. Does anyone know what this could have been? So first, a little context. My house was built in 1599 for a wealthy farming family. The house has had extensions from the Victorian era and most recently the 70s, but much of the original home remains. It was a couple of days ago, but I was in my living room, half watching the news and half on my phone. My dog, who is a very old and chilled-back greyhound, suddenly jerks up from the sofa and looks directly to our window doors looking down at the garden. At the time, the curtains were closed, so I thought he maybe heard a fox or had been disturbed by a pesky fly or something. And because I know that dogs can sometimes sense ghosts, I joked, asking if Granddad had popped in to say hello. He was still staring, and then suddenly something tapped the back door quite loudly. Thinking it could be a fox after the chickens, I stood up and opened the curtains and looked out. Dark, but no fox. Then I heard it. It was almost like breathing. At first I thought it was the dog, but as I looked at him, he was facing the other way now. Yet still I heard breathing, quiet, but inside the room. I thought I had overreacted and it was my own breath, so I sat down. Yet it persisted and got slightly louder, and then I felt dizzy. It was like it was getting more intense, but not louder. And it felt like that dizziness you get if you stand up too fast after sitting for a while. But that made no sense, as I had been on my feet and fine just moments ago. I don't know how to describe it, but it got worse, and I could feel myself panicking despite my best efforts to stay calm, which, surprisingly to me, did not work. And soon it was too much. I went out of the room and upstairs into my own room, and I stayed there for the rest of the night. What made it even worse, though, was that while I sat there, trying to comprehend what had just happened, I heard footsteps right below me. I still can't explain it. My boyfriend passed at the end of March, and I haven't felt his presence until lately. I'm pregnant, and I've been in my nesting phase lately. I was setting up the bassinet and figuring out what sheets to buy, getting ready for bed. I put a blanket down in the bassinet because my cat likes to sit in it, not for when the baby gets here. And I looked out my window, which looks into my neighbor's closet. My neighbor has stained glass for privacy, but I saw my boyfriend's silhouette in the window. I shook it off as somebody else in the closet, but when I looked back up a couple of minutes later, it was still there, with a hand pressed on the glass. I couldn't mistake it. It was him, down to the haircut. I started crying immediately. And then I smelled his scent and felt a warm, comforting feeling. It's been a couple of months since he passed, and I've always been sensitive to energy shifts and the paranormal. I found it weird that I hadn't felt his presence, but the closer I get to my due date, the more I feel him around. My family and I have always been animal lovers. I've never known a time when we didn't have cats or dogs with us, and I feel like they helped raise me. When my father was in college, he adopted 2 cats named Tigger and Cedo. Tigger passed away due to a coyote, and after she passed, Cedo was never the same. She was grumpy and preferred to be by herself. But I would annoy her with my love anyway. One night, I was carrying her in a wicker basket with some blankets. I would bring her room to room with me as I cleaned up. I'd been petting her and listening to her purr when she suddenly stopped moving. I was maybe 12, and I remember praying for the first time to bring her back to me. It was awful to bring her out to my mom and tell her she had passed. I had a tradition that whenever a pet died, I would make a concrete headstone with little marbles and their name on it. I had set it on our kitchen counter to dry, and I left it there. The next morning, I checked on it and found a small piece of her fur right in the center. I went around to everyone and asked if they had placed it there, and they all said that they had not. It felt like she was giving me one last piece of her. I kept it in a tiny knick-knack tea kettle. It lives there with a few of her whiskers that I had found weeks after her passing. I feel like she came to give me one last gift. This happened over 30 years ago, so I'll explain the incident as best as I can remember. When I was 3, my grandma on my maternal side died of a heart attack. While at the funeral, the adults were outside talking, smoking cigarettes, etc. Myself, my older brother, and another family member close to our age were told to stay inside to keep us out of conversations that we didn't need to hear, according to my parents. Well, the other family member convinced my brother that locking me in the viewing room, with those red lights over the coffin on, was a good idea. Once they locked me in, the other family member called through the door that Grandma needed to take me with her because I was her favorite. I screamed and cried as loud as my little self could, and some adults took me outside to my parents. I was told that they were just playing, and that even though Grandma loved me, she was never going to take me away. They were doing their best to soothe a very upset 3-year-old. Later that year, we moved 2 states away from there. One night in the new house, 4 years later, I woke up in the middle of the night. According to my mom, this was very unusual. I heard a song that only my grandma sang to me. I sat up looking around, and I see the lid on my old toy box opening by itself. Once it was fully open, I saw what looked like my grandma standing slowly from inside that box. She turned slowly and creepily around to look at me. I was frozen in place. I couldn't cry, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even move. Then she started walking toward me. She stepped close to the bed and said, "I came to get you. You were always my favorite, and now I want you to be with me." Somehow I found my voice and screamed. My mom came running in, and just before she got to my room, my grandma said, "I'll come back for you again," and vanished. My mother came in, asking who I was talking to. I told her everything. My mom let me sleep in the living room for a few nights while she got rid of my toy box. The toy box was the last thing my grandma had ever given me before she died. To this day, I have no idea what happened. All I know is that wasn't Grandma.